It was 11 years ago last month when then Vice President Dick Cheney spoke to the graduating class at West Point. He said to those young graduating officers, "If there is anyone in the world today who doubts the seriousness of the Bush doctrine, I would urge that person to consider the fate of the Taliban in Afghanistan and of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq." Okay, Mr. Cheney, I will consider the plight of the Taliban and Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, because now after 12 years of war, tens of thousands of deaths, trillions of dollars spent, the Taliban is making a resurgence in Afghanistan, and the old government of Saddam Hussein, in the form of ISIS, is sweeping back into control in Iraq. Based on the facts of history, the Bush doctrine was an absolute murderous nightmare. In light of the religious civil war in Iraq, a nearly completely inept news media has rushed out to give interviews to the very people who were absolutely wrong about everything they said about Afghanistan and Iraq a decade ago. I cannot imagine how the likes of Dick Cheney, John McCain, Paul Wolfowitz, or even Mitt Romney can imagine that anyone cares at all about what they have to say on this topic, yet the media has rushed to record their completely irrational views. Still, even some who have sold out to right-wing extremism as much as Fox News has, Megyn Kelly had to pull the plug on Cheney's narcissistic ramblings to remind him that he had been entirely mistaken in every prediction he made about Iraq during his time in office, and that no amount of revisionist history can change those facts. But both on the left and the right, we have been treated to a couple of weeks of very public recriminations of Iraq's Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, for not having created a coalition government that gave Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds all an equal share in power. Now, I'm going to say that again a little bit slower so it can sink in. Republican and Democratic elected politicians in the United States have criticized al-Maliki because he hasn't been able to create a cooperative government in which people of different parties work together peacefully. It may be that once Western powers withdraw their forces and allow the tribal and religious contests of the Middle East to run their course, that there will be a dramatic redrawing of the boundary lines that separate many of these nations. We may see forming a fairly monolithic Sunni and Shia separate nations and a new Kurdistan reemerging in their midst, maybe even a new Persia. What I do know with certainty is what I've said about this for more than a decade, that American military intervention can only make it worse. I wish there was an evil empire somewhere that we could attack and say we're going to fight evil because evil is here. But what we've learned over the last century is whoever we ally with in invading another country turns out to be our enemy a very few years later, and now trillions of dollars and a fortune in military hardware has been captured by the people that we went over there to fight. At some point, we have to recognize that we can't fix this militarily. You cannot thread a needle with a bomb. And what we are doing militarily is succeeding in making enemies and killing people and impoverishing our own nation. And more than economically impoverishing us, we are morally impoverishing ourselves by continuing to do this. Amen. Thank you. And even when the civil wars are over, the Middle East is facing a huge crisis in the very near future that for some reason I never hear mentioned by any of the policy wonks or in the media. And that is that alternative fuel sources will destroy the dwindling reserves of crude oil that fund the existence of most of these governments. Imagine a Saudi Arabia, an Iraq, an Iran, a Kuwait without a huge influx of foreign dollars to prop up their economy. Imagine the now wildly overpopulated Egypt without the economic support of their oil-rich neighbors. If I were the czar of the Middle East right now, if I could become a benevolent dictator of the entire Middle East, I would immediately enact a version of China's one-child program to quickly reduce the population. There's way too many people living in countries that are subsidized by oil money that is going away. And I would try to build a manufacturing and agricultural base that would allow them to peacefully support themselves in the future. Because in the 21st century, oil will not be the driving force. Many of you are old enough to remember that our involvement in Vietnam was originally because that was the world's richest source of rubber. At what point would we fight a war over rubber at this juncture in history? We wouldn't again, because what we didn't recognize during those years is that we would come up with synthetic products that would no longer need rubber trees. We will no longer need crude oil in a very few years. It's just not going to determine the global economy. But we have had a foreign policy in the United States, both Republican and Democrat, that acted like the world for the next 100 years was going to be based exactly like the world was in 1950. There never was an Andy of Mayberry. It doesn't exist, and it didn't exist. That world will not exist in the future. Nothing else but a radical change in population and in manufacturing and agriculture can give the Middle East any hope for a sustainable future after the next 30 or 40 years are past. No military action, no government manipulation can solve the real problems that lie ahead of them. Maybe the Sunnis will prevail, maybe it will be the Shia or the Kurds, but without a radically different economy, they are all going to starve. This is a real issue, and it is not being discussed by our government or our media. Now, I'm not an isolationist, but I have come to regard these Middle Eastern challenges something like my desire to help my daughter choose the man that she will marry. I'm confident that I know more about this than she does and that I could make a better choice. I feel like her happiness, stability, and security would be better served by just letting me choose who she decides to marry. I have come to accept that I am not going to be given that authority. All that I can do for my daughter to guide her into a healthy family life is to set a good example of a healthy marriage and a healthy family life for her, in which case I need to get busy. I need to get busy getting my own house in order, getting my life straightened out, and doing it in a way that gives her a good example. And that, I believe, should describe our Middle East foreign policy. That if we could be a democratic nation in a way that was admirable, and all the foreign students that come to us from the Middle East and live in the United States for 3 or 4 years and earn a degree here and go back, that's much better than sending troops into their countries. If we could role model a working democracy, then we've got a message that the world may want to pay attention to and emulate. They will not do it at the point of a bayonet. This week, as we celebrate Independence Day in the United States, replete with all the fireworks that are, of course, imitation of artillery and the bomb blasts of war, the war that gave us independence from that foreign nation that used to think if they invaded with enough troops that they could teach us how to run a democracy, then we can face some serious challenges. While the Middle East is seeing the future of the oil market collapse, we are now riding a tidal wave of new resources of natural gas, even a renewed oil market as we have figured out how to get oil from places that we couldn't before. We are now standing on the brink of an economically feasible wind and solar power revolution. The economy and the political face of the world is going to change, and it is going to change dramatically. no great social change is good for everyone. Massive transfers of power and wealth necessarily means that there will be winners and there will be losers. The only thing that we can be certain of is that the status quo in America, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia will not remain the same. Good outcomes are not guaranteed on any of these continents. People may become more free, or governments may become more authoritarian. You remember a couple of years ago that there were many people excited by the Arab Spring and the liberation movements in Egypt. You ask someone living in Egypt whether their government has become more free or more authoritarian as a result of the literal turnover of power. Wealth needs to be distributed more equitably in the world, but all of the trends right now point towards an accelerating move of capital into the hands of the super rich. So 4th of July celebrations are usually marked by fireworks, baseball games, loud music, picnics, and political speeches about how great our nation is. Most of the applause at these events go to our military veterans and the chest-thumping politicians who are looking for reasons to send another generation of young women and men onto the battlefield. I want to take a few minutes in the midst of this holiday week to talk about American greatness, and not about what made America great in the past when we emerged from the other nations of the world as a global military and economic power, but I want to talk about a great America in the future. Now, I know our iTunes audience tends to turn me off after 7 or 8 minutes, and I want to encourage our internet audience to hit the pause button, go make yourself a great big cup of coffee, because I've got something to say I'd like for you to hear. Those of you who are already here, you really are without options. You're going to have to stick with me through this unless you want to be embarrassed. And Rob, just turn the camera on anyone that gets up and leaves. Would you just get a good tight shot of that? I want to talk about American exceptionalism, but not from a partisan Democrat or Republican perspective, but from the perspective of this church. Our progressive faith is rooted in the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth about radical compassion. We are invested in social justice ethics, a social justice that seeks the greatest good for the largest number of people. If we've got a 10 commandments, it's all distilled into one. You seek the greatest good for the largest number of people. Because of that approach to ethics, more often than not, we will tend to sound like Democrats more than we will Republicans. But when it comes down to actually living out our values, I don't think we owe our loyalty to any party. Let me just say some things that I think Republicans and Democrats and independents should work on together to make America the greatest nation in the world. And I want you to hear these as my spiritual and religious values and not simply as political values. Number one, we should stop all military interventions in foreign countries except when a broad international coalition is taking action to stop a genocide. If there is something going on in the world that is so murderous, so horrific, that it needs to be stopped, we shouldn't have to stop it alone. If we tell ourselves that we have to stop it alone, there's probably something wrong with the proposal. But where we can use our military in a broad international coalition to stop a genocide or stop an invasion, that should be done. We can use our superior military hardware, intelligence, and abilities to stop horrible social crimes. But folks, we have used our superior military equipment, intelligence, and ability to commit horrible social crimes. That's got to stop. Number two, we should dramatically downsize our military presence in foreign countries, closing military bases that have not been needed since the end of World War II and the Cold War. We should, I believe, reduce our military budget so that we can have a military that can reasonably defend our borders, but not try to enforce an empire-like control over the rest of the world. Thirdly, our federal budget should be dramatically redesigned away from military spending and towards priorities in scientific and medical research, education, alternative energy, mass transit, and infrastructure. And about that, I'd like to offer some specifics. Education is key to success in the 21st century. As such, we should stop debating what interest rate we should charge students who actually are trying to further their education so that they can make America the greatest nation in the world. Students that are studying topics and areas that enhance our nation's ability to become a great and strong nation shouldn't have to pay to go to school. There is currently little or no connection between higher education and what our society needs. We have to recognize that there are fields of study that are crucial to our nation and others that are distinctly less so. I have a degree in philosophy. I don't think anybody should subsidize a degree in philosophy. You should be glad that there are a few of us around that are sitting around thinking about philosophy. But we need more nurses, and we need more engineers, we need more scientists, we need more doctors, we need more people that are trained in the actual invention and creation of what makes the world works. We don't need to underwrite degrees for 100 more marketing degrees or communication degrees for the one person that managed to get an engineering degree that actually knows how to build a bridge. Yes, the world does need people who study the humanities, who study music, who write poetry. We may even need a couple of preachers, certainly not more than that, and not more than one or two politicians. But our education system has gotten completely out of sync with our reality. Why should we graduate so many people with degrees that don't give them skills and talents in the world of math and science and physics and biology and chemistry where we really need them? Also on that point, much of what has made America great in the past was our superiority in these fields. For a century, most of the significant life-changing inventions in the world have come from the United States. We are an innovative, creative, and imaginative people, largely because of our diversity, by the way. One of the things that we kick the goat at the most is the racial and international blend that we have to try to figure out how to make that work. Nations that have absolute plenums of a single cultural history are never anything like as inventive and creative as we are. Our diversity is one of our greatest strengths, and yet it's what people seem to want to fight all of the time. We are the smartest, most inventive people in the world, and yet we have put our most gifted people onto Wall Street and into the military-industrial complex. We need to get those people back into the business of inventing and designing for the civil market. We invented automobiles, airplanes, radios, television, spaceships, computers, cell phones, the internet, and Hot Pockets. I never said we got it all right. Everybody makes a mistake now and then. But we have led the world in medical research, in agricultural sciences, in transportation and communication, but then we allow the rest of the world to make the profit off of creating the jobs, and they do it better. We have done more and better medical research than any other country in the world, and yet we have the worst delivery system of our health care. So why can you buy American-made pharmaceuticals for a third the price in Canada? Because they have a government that cares about whether their population is sick or not. We've got to get back into that stream of thinking. High-tech inventions come out of our Silicon Valley, but all the jobs they create end up in Asia, and too much of the profits end up in secretive tax-sheltered offshore accounts. We need to get our greatest minds back in the fields of research and development, and we need to structure our economy so that our American genius translates into good-paying jobs in manufacturing and sales in the United States. Fourthly, I hope you all are taking notes, to become the greatest nation in the world, we have to come to grips with the fact that not only are we not in Kansas anymore, but there never was a Mayberry. While I'm deeply concerned about the social and health impacts of drug abuse, our war on drugs has proven to be an abysmal failure. It was based on an imagination set in a 1950s sitcom. It never made any sense, and it has never worked. During this alleged war on drugs, our incarceration rate in the United States over these 40 years has gone up by 800%, now reaching 2 million citizens in jails and prison. 2 million citizens who have family, brothers and sisters, spouses, children. We are robbing our nation of the resources needed to fund our schools while we are ruining the integrity of millions of families. We should begin immediately to release every single person who is currently in jail for marijuana possession or use. We should wipe out any related criminal history from their records that keeps them from getting decent jobs, educations, or being able to start a business or buy a home. Marijuana should be legal, taxed, and regulated. Proceeds from that taxation should be used to fund addiction treatment programs and substance abuse counseling. Unlike a lot of the political jargon on this topic, I do believe that there are people who have serious problems related to marijuana use, but not nearly as many as have a problem with alcohol abuse and addiction, and we've managed to make it legal and regulate it and tax it. Fifthly, America has two great sources of historical shame. The first is our treatment of Native American Indians, and the second was our violent and abusive practice of slavery. Our Band-Aid approaches to these past grievous sins has only made matters worse, destroying the dignity and family integrity of both Indians and African Americans. Reparations are in order, but in my opinion, not in the form of a financial direct handout to people with Indian or African ancestry, but the reparations should come in the form of an all-out education and jobs program that dramatically changes the future of Native Americans and of African Americans. Ours is one of the only nations in the world where school funding is based on the property values around the school. We have allowed poor districts to have the most impoverished schools, while wealthy districts, where the children already have every economic advantage in the world, have the best schools. That has to be reversed, as it is in most progressive nations of the world. The most money should go to the schools that need the resources the most. And it doesn't take long to see why life on an Indian reservation or in an inner city broken down neighborhood where the schools are broken are not leading to the radical compassion that we people of faith say is the heart of who we understand ourselves to be and what would make America the greatest nation on earth. We cannot realistically give North America back to the dozens of Indian nations forced off this land, nor could we give former African slaves their pre-slavery lives. But we can make them real property owners and people with a career and a future in America. And that can be done through a serious education and job creation program. Sixth, gasoline-powered private automobiles gave us our modern life. It created the 20th century. But that approach to life is not sustainable. It's killing the environment, it's using up our natural resources while killing 40,000 people a year in traffic accidents. We need to rebuild our nation's transportation system around a fuel-efficient mass transit powered increasingly by alternative energy sources. Unfortunately, all of the lobbyists work for automobile, oil, and highway construction companies. We have allowed them to keep our nation deeply invested in the last century, while Western European countries and China are pulling far ahead of us into the 21st century. We can either resolve to catch up, or we can accept that we are going to become a country of a third world status, where we are in service to the nations that had the forward-looking ability to change their approach to gasoline internal combustion engines. Seventh, finally, it comes down to job creation that is good for our nation and good for our personal health and the health of our environment. But it's not just jobs. As Jim Hightower observed, slaves had 100% employment. It's not just jobs. The salaries have to make sense. We have cheap food and cheap clothing and cheap manufactured goods because we have lowered our standards to the point where we don't even notice if our clothes are manufactured by children living in slavery or if our food is harvested by virtual slaves who live among us as illegal immigrants. And we have to become willing to live in a world that is sustainable and that we pay the price so that the people at the other end of the equation have a decent life. We've got to stop buying disposable goods and eating imitation foods. We need to stop shipping tomatoes 2,000 miles from a vine in Central America to a grocery store in the Ozarks, and we need to dramatically shift our food supply away from foreign sources and make agriculture an honorable, livable industry in the United States again. We should stop genetically modifying our foods. We should stop injecting our animals in our food chain with antibiotics, and we need to stop drenching our vegetables in poisons. Now, when we do that, we're going to pay a lot more for our food. There'll be spots on our apples, and strawberries will be about the size of the end of your thumb instead of the size of your fist. But we will restore to the United States a class of farmers that we can respect and who have self-respect and a decent life. Our shoes will cost 4 or 5 times as much if you pay someone a living wage to make them. We'll just have to get by with 12 pairs of shoes instead of 6 pairs of shoes. If my clothing and shoes necessitates 25 kids living in slavery in Malaysia, South Korea, and China so that I can fill a huge walk-in closet, then something's going to have to change. We're going to have to learn to live with a lot less, unless, of course, we just have a cold, hard place where our hearts were supposed to be. America has the genius to be great again, but we have to want it. It will not happen by accident, and it will not happen by our following the path of least resistance. Greatness is in our genes. It's in our spirits. But it's not in our shuttered factories, our coal mines, and our army bases. It is in our hearts. If only we can get it out of our imagination, and get it into our government, and into our schools, and into our economy, and God help us, into our churches.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.